Hey guys, tonight we're chilling, literally. So settle in, dim the lights, wrap yourself up like a leftover burrito in a blanket, because we are going to take a very slow, very uneventful walk through the history of keeping milk, meat, and other suspiciously perishable items from turning into biohazards. And honestly, it's more interesting than you think. Or maybe it's exactly as boring as you think, which is why it's perfect for bedtime. Because food has always gone bad. Ancient people didn't have the luxury of tossing old yogurt into the trash and buying a new one. They had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they dug holes in the ground and hoped for the best. Let's start way back, in the prehistoric era. Cavemen. You know, the original of the grid lifestyle influencers. They didn't exactly have Tupperware or cute Pinterest pantry hacks. What they had were caves, cold rivers, and the general principle of stick it somewhere dark and hope it lasts. Ice and snow were the obvious go-tos. If you lived in a place with actual winter, you could just bury your mammoth steak in a snowbank and come back to it later. Problem solved. Of course, the problem was that not everyone lived in a snow globe. If you were somewhere hot, say Mesopotamia, you were out of luck. Your food was going to rot faster than you could say fermented goat milk. That's where people started experimenting with other methods, drying, salting, smoking. Basically turning meat into jerky before jerky was cool. And yes, it kept things edible. But tonight, we are focusing not on preservation in general, but specifically on cooling, actual cold storage, which is way harder without electricity. Now fast forward to the ancient Egyptians. Around 2500 BCE, they were already playing with evaporative cooling. Here's the trick. If you put water in a porous clay jar, some of it seeps out and evaporates. That evaporation takes heat with it, which means the water inside gets cooler, not fridge level cold, but cooler. Imagine drinking slightly chilled Nile water out of a clay jug. That was considered fancy. And for solid food, they sometimes buried things in the sand or stored them in cellars beneath their houses, basically using the earth as a natural fridge, which sounds clever until you remember that Egypt was also home to a lot of ants and rodents, and, let's just say, your underground food pantry might not have been entirely yours. Meanwhile, up in ancient China, they were taking it a little more seriously. By 1100 BCE, the Chinese elite were actually harvesting and storing ice. They built large pits lined with straw and bamboo to keep the ice from melting. These were like early ice houses, long before Europe caught onto the trend. Having ice in the summer was a serious status symbol. Nothing said I'm wealthy, like casually serving cold wine while everyone else was sweating through their silk robes. And of course, the Chinese being the Chinese, they actually had bureaucrats in charge of this. Yes, an official ice storage department. Because heaven forbid the emperor run out of chilled melon slices in July. Now let's drift over to Greece and Rome. Because of course the Greeks and Romans had their own cooling hacks. They were obsessed with mixing snow or ice with wine. Which sounds classy, but keep in mind they were scraping ice out of mountains and hauling it down on donkeys. By the time it reached your villa, it was basically half melted slush. Still, it was trendy. The wealthy built underground storage rooms called hypogea, where they'd stash perishable food. They also used amphorae, those classic big clay jars buried partly underground, to keep oils, cheeses, and wine at a relatively stable temperature. Romans even imported snow from the Apennine Mountains to Rome itself, which means some poor slave was trudging up a mountain with a sack of snow on his back, while his master complained about the temperature of his grape juice. Priorities, and yes, there were actual snow vendors in Rome. People literally sold ice and snow by weight, like an ancient version of a 7-Eleven Slurpee machine. Only, less hygienic. By the Middle Ages, Europeans had gotten a bit more practical. They built ice houses. These were large insulated pits or stone buildings designed to hold ice cut from lakes and rivers during winter. The ice was packed in straw, sawdust, or even animal dung to keep it from melting. Romantic, I know. The concept was simple. Cut huge blocks of ice in January, bury them under layers of insulation, and hope you still had some left by July. If you did, congratulations. You were living the medieval version of luxury.